Folks, welcome to the second episode. Believe it, we made it to a second episode of the Hall of Fame road trip. Billboard Chart Guy here, coming to you on the Kirk Minahan Network. Of course, as always, thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Dave, for also the support. We are today going to be talking about Baseball Hall of Fame, and we're going to head to Cooperstown by way of Flushing, New York. And I am thrilled to have the one and only Chris Klemmer join the pod today. And we're going to focus on the 60th anniversary of the New York Mets. And we're going to talk about the 17. And I was surprised at that number, Chris. There are 17 Hall of Famers who have played for the Mets over the years. So first of all, Chris, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is very exciting, Billboard Charts Guy. A long time since we talked.
I know.
Wow.
I've gone radio silent on some airways. Yes.
Yes, there are 17 people, but look, you're absolutely right. There are 17 Hall of Famers that have played at least a game for the Mets, but there are really only two Hall of Famers that are real Mets, and that's of course Tom Seaver and now Mike Piazza. And I think that's how Mets fans look at it. If you think back to like when Citi Field opened, or even when Shea Stadium closed, Seaver threw the last pitch to Piazza, and then Seaver threw the first pitch to Piazza when Citi Field opened. So those two Mets fans consider those two like on their own mountaintop. Even like guys like David Wright or Jerry Koosman or even Keith Hernandez, Seaver and Piazza are on their own level.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with that. I would also add, as kind of true Mets Hall of Famers, Gary Carter and Gil Hodges, who's going to be inducted this year. Carter, obviously, key to the 86 championship, the last championship for the Mets, and Gil Hodges managed the first championship team. The rest of the list, kind of guys at the tail end of their careers. One guy just kills me that he did not finish his career with the Mets, but we're going to go over it. So Chris, I thought we'd kind of power through the list. We'll be brief on some of these guys. We'll expand the conversation on some of the others, and then want to get your take on the 22 team. I know you've been very excited about it on Twitter and chats, and they're off to an amazing start. So I think that's the plan. And then finally, I'd like to close with an idea for a podcast for you.
All right. I also do want to talk Team Hall of Fame as well, because the Mets have their own Team Hall of Fame, and I have some things I don't love what they're doing with that.
Okay. Perfect.
So, I guess, if you're a baseball fan, I guess this is great. If you're not a baseball fan, this could be a rough sled, though, I imagine.
I would imagine it is, especially talking about a specific team. But let's give it a shot. Let's power through this. So 1966, Casey Stengel was inducted. He was inducted as a manager. He was put in by the Veterans Committee. He was the first Mets manager. Way before both of our time, but kind of the first face of the New York Mets. 72, Yogi Berra was inducted. Well,
let's talk Stengel for a second, because the Stengel thing's interesting. So Stengel was, like you said, manager of the Mets. He was forced to retire from the Yankees after they lost the 1960 World Series, and then he managed the team from 62 to 65. And in 65, I believe he was sitting on a bar stool middle of the season. Casey, much like myself, enjoyed a couple of beverages now and then. And he fell off the stool and broke his hip. And that forced him to retire. And he was replaced by Wes Westrom, who was not a fun manager to play for. And obviously wasn't a very good manager. But Stengel's wasn't very good at the Mets either. The team was horrifically horrible. And no one could save that team, but Stengel did them no favors, but at least Stengel was having fun. He made it a fun environment as they transitioned from Polo Grounds to Shea Stadium. But the thing with Stengel, though, is I think they were waiting to put him in the Hall of Fame. Like, they were waiting for him to leave the Mets, obviously. So it's no coincidence that, say, I think it was July or August 66 or 65, he breaks his hip. And then the very next year he's in Cooperstown.
That's right. Yeah. And that first season, 40 and 120. The worst expansion team. And I know you're a fan of expansion teams.
Really, ever. The Cleveland Spiders in the 1800s were a worse team. You had the Tigers about 15 or so years ago. They lost 119 games. But that 62 Mets is funny because that 62 Mets team, like, yeah, they were terrible. They were a bad team. But if you look at some of the individual players, they had, we'll get into a Hall of Famer, Richie Ashburn, but that team wasn't terrible. Like, they weren't. Gil Hodges on that team too, but obviously at the end of their. But like Frank Thomas hit over 30 home runs for them that year. They had a decent pitching staff with Roger Craig and Al Jackson. Like, that team shouldn't have lost 120 games. That's an insane number.
Didn't Roger Craig lose 20 games that year?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And he didn't pitch that badly. And I guess they, obviously I'm too young to have seen them, but I guess they were horrific in the field. Like, they were just throwing the ball everywhere. They had a marvelous Marv Throneberry at first base. They had some catching issues with Choo Coleman. I guess it was kind of a mess defensively. And that's why maybe if you just look at the offensive stats and just the ERA, it doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a rough team, but it's actually a legendary team. In the history of the organization. So Yogi Berra, 1972, and he was inducted, and he had just become the Mets manager in the spring of 72 after the unfortunate and unexpected passing of Gil Hodges. Yogi played 4 games with the Mets in 1965. He then went on to manage from 72 into the 75 season. He was let go in the middle of 75. Roy McMillan took over, but he did lead the Mets to the 1973 National League Championship.
The Berra thing's interesting. So Berra, he played with the Mets, like you said, for 4 games. He was a coach on the team, I believe, and they had him suit up. It was a mistake because if you take those 4 games away, his entire career as a Yankee. So, if you look at it, ideally, Yogi Berra probably should have just only played as a Yankee. I don't think those 4 games did very much to help his career stats. If I can talk, it had come a year after he was a manager. So he managed the 64 Yankees, and they lost the World Series, and then he was fired because they had a plan in August that they were going to fire him no matter what. And he ended up having a surprise run. He got him to the 64 World Series against the Cardinals, and the Cardinals won, and they fired Berra. And Berra ended up going. I think a big reason Berra went to the Mets was as a fuck you to the Yankees. I think he was so pissed off that he'd just been fired after being a game away from the World Series. And so he goes there and he's a coach. And then, like I said, he becomes the manager after Gil Hodges drops dead after playing golf right before the season started in 72. He was walking back from the golf course and he just collapsed. His heart exploded. And he's obviously a manager for the Mets in 73 when they went to the World Series, and they lost in 7 games as well.
Yeah. So the issue with Yogi and the 73 series is he started, the Mets were up 3-2. They went back to Oakland, and they, instead of starting a fully rested George Stone in Game 6, who went 12-3 that year, they went with Tom Seaver on short rest, and unfortunately Seaver didn't have it that day, and that led them to pitch Matlack on short rest in Game 7, and he got crushed. I think Reggie hit at least 1 homer that game, and so for a lot of older Met fans, the decision not to start George Stone in Game 6 is a real, it's a crawl in the line.
Oh, it's a terrible move. You can't. I mean, the only thing is, though, if you look at that team, that 73 A's team was so much more talented than the 73 Mets team. That 73 A's team was in the middle of they won 3 World Series in a row, 72, 73, 74. They were incredibly stacked, and free agency is what ruined that dynasty. And in fact, a couple of those A's players ended up going to the Yankees, and they wound up being back-to-back in 77 and 78. So, right. But the Mets, though, they probably had no business being there. It was all pitching. They had very little offense in that team. So Yogi Berra did a great job for most of the year with that team. But yeah, you're right, though. The Stone, I mean, that's probably unforgivable.
Right. And let's call it as we see it. I mean, they clinched the division on the last day of the season in Chicago, and then they beat the Big Red Machine. They weren't the Big Red Machine just yet, but they had been in the series against the A's the previous year. They were a much more talented team, but again, pitching wins, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that brings up a good point. So, or a point I was thinking of earlier. So, I'm sure we'll get into Nolan Ryan in a bit, but before we do, though, you look back at that 1969 Mets team. You have Tom Seaver, you have Nolan Ryan, you have Jerry Koosman, you got John Matlack waiting in the wings. You have Ken Singleton, a very good outfielder who they later traded for Rusty Staub. He's waiting in the wings. Tug McGraw. You have this stacked team. If you had told me in 1970 that this team is not going to win another World Series with these group of players, I wouldn't have believed you. I can't believe they only went back to one. I mean, this is typical Mets, where the Mets have this happens again in the 80s, where you have these stacked teams. And the 86 obviously team wins, but that team should have won 3 or 4. That team was that talented. And I feel the same way about the 69 team. Now, would they have beaten the Reds every year to go to the World Series? Probably not. Those Reds teams are really good, but I'll be damned. They would have won the East a number of times. That NL East stunk for a good portion of the early and mid 70s. You had the Pirates who were old. Or either too old or too young, but they still managed to, they rode Roberto Clemente and they got another ring. But those teams weren't particularly great. And those Mets teams should have won more and just made a number of bad trades, and a number of bad luck happened as well. But it's a shame. Seaver, Ryan, Koosman, Matlack, and imagine that team in 1973 or 74. Man, that's 4 20-game winners potentially. I mean, that it's a real shame.
I'll also throw in, you mentioned Singleton and the rest. I'll also mention Amos Otis was in their farm system, and he got traded to the Royals for Joe Foy, who was their first attempt at solving the third base problem.
That was back in '68, right?
I think it was 70.
Okay. I think you're right. It was right after the World Series. You're exactly right. Because the GM died. Johnny Murphy was the GM of the 69 Mets. And you think, all right, great. You got this GM. We're all set. And then in January of 70, his heart explodes, basically. He's watching TV.
Right.
And he died. And then you figure 2 years later, Gil Hodges dies. And that was the brain trust, that 69 team. And in 2 years later, they're both dead. It's really unfortunate for their families, especially, but also for the Mets fans at that time, I imagine. That must have been so frustrating to watch that team get slowly disassembled, and to the point, obviously, where Seaver ends up getting traded away.
Right, and we'll spend a little more time on that situation when we get to Tom. So a couple of quick ones here. Let's just keep going. Warren Spahn. 20 games with the Mets in 1965. He won 363 games, mostly with the Braves of Milwaukee. Crafty lefty, but he was 43 or 44 when he was with the Mets. Not much.
You're gonna rattle through, I guess, a few names here, and just if you don't know, keep in mind the Mets had a strategy. Their GM in the early 60s was a former Yankees GM. And their whole thing is, listen, we're going to bring in old players to try to fill up the Polo Grounds and then eventually Shea Stadium. Guys like Gil Hodges, obviously we mentioned before, Richie Ashburn, and then Warren Spahn. So bring in some of these older players that the fans have some sort of connection. Because remember that you have all these Dodgers and Giants fans who were used to seeing these National League players play, and they wanted some of that familiarity. And I actually think it helped. In the short term with attendance. I think it helped build a sense of community with the Mets and New York. By 65, though, when Spahn gets there, I think at some point you got to really focus on rebuilding. And I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to have a 42-year-old taking the ball every fifth day. I don't know if that's the best strategy.
Exactly. Willie Mays was a Met for a year and a half, 72, 73. He was inducted into the Hall in 1979.
And Willie Mays, if you talk to some older Mets fans who used to be Giants fans, that's a real connection for them. So, Willie Mays, of course, started his career in New York with the Giants before they moved to San Francisco in '58. And a lot of people, you say who's kind of that next. You mentioned Gary Carter and Gil Hodges. Carter, of course, has an Expos hat on in Cooperstown, and Gil Hodges will have a Brooklyn Dodgers one, as he should. But I think the fifth guy on that list, if you had to rank these as far as love from Mets fans, would be Willie Mays. When Willie Mays came back in '72, it's my understanding that he was people were going just crazy. They were so happy to have Willie Mays back in New York. He was happy to be back. Obviously, he made some mistakes in the '73 World Series because he was just so old and had no business probably being the outfield at that point. But there's a real affinity for the Willie Mays with the Mets fans still. The older ones.
Absolutely. And I remember it happening probably saw highlights subsequently, but in his first game back with the Mets, he hit a game-winning home run. Again, I think it was against the Giants.
It may have been. He was traded. Was it Charlie Williams, like a relief pitcher or like a swing starter? But the Mets were happy to make that deal, and like I said, it really did work out for them. Now that's the thing. I know Willie Mays would come back in the '70s a lot, and like like old timer type games, and make appearances and stuff. I think Willie Mays still has that. Obviously, he's always going to be a Giant. He's always going to be linked with San Francisco, but much like Hank Aaron with the Braves and Milwaukee, and he played for the Brewers later. Willie Mays, same kind of thing with the Mets.
Absolutely. And speaking of center fielders, Duke Snider was inducted in 1980. He played with the 1963 Mets, kind of based on what you said with George Weiss and his theory about bringing in older National League players. Exactly. 407 home runs across his career, mostly, again, Brooklyn and LA Dodgers. 1992, the franchise is inducted into the Hall of Fame. I think at that point, he garnered the highest percentage of any person inducted into the Hall at that point. It was like 98.7% getting into the Hall. 311 wins, 2.86 ERA. Obviously a lot of Met fans love Tom Seaver. He was, to many people, if you grew up in Chicago in the mid to late '80s, what Michael Jordan was, that's what Tom Seaver was to young Met fans. He would. I think we chatted about this in recently, but in 1977, the contract dispute, which led him to be traded. There was some, not so great newspaper articles, which probably were planted by M. Donald Grant at the time, who was leading the ownership, reported some jealousy between Tom Seaver's wife was jealous of Nolan Ryan because he was now making more money as a California Angel. So they shipped him out basically for a bag of balls to the Reds. I mean, it was four players for one. It certainly wasn't worth what Tom Seaver was and meant to the team. Chris, I don't know, how old are you? Do you remember that clearly, or are you too young for the Seaver trade?
Oh, not only do I not remember, I was 2 years before I was born. I don't really remember Tom Seaver playing. I remember in '86 with the Red Sox, and like he had a baseball card come out that year. I was 6 or 7, so I have some connection to that, to like him at the end of his career. Mm-hmm. And I honestly, my biggest memories of Tom Seaver is calling Mets games. Like the next couple of years after that, he called the local Mets games in New York. And so I have more memories of him as a color analyst than I do as a player. I have virtually none as a player.
Yeah. So, I mean, he came back in '83. They brought him back. They traded Charlie Palaio to the Reds to get Tom Seaver back. He opened the season. He had a decent season, and he was in his late 30s at that point, but, did a good job. I think he may have won 11 or 12 games with a not great Mets team, but they were up and coming. They had a lot of
Strawberries year. It was the same year they traded for Keith Hernandez. I think he only won like 8 or 9 games, but he had a decent ERA. He made every start. He certainly was a decent addition to that rotation. Right. But then they left him available in a free agent draft of sorts they had back in the 80s.
Yeah, and he ended up, the White Sox picked him up, and in '84 and '85, he won 16 games in each of those seasons. And I just can't help to think that if Seaver was in the rotation in '84 or '85 with Gooden, Darling, Fernandez, you might have gotten past the Cubs and or the Cardinals in both of those years.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that '85 team. That '85 team was stacked, and they won 97 or 98 games, and because of the way the playoff structure was back then, they didn't even make the playoffs.
98 games, 98.
So, the Cardinals won the East that year, so it's really that must have been really frustrating. I guess the only thing was the next year they win the World Series. For me as a Mets fan, because I'm younger too, where I distinctly remember '88, so and '87 as well. It's more frustrating that it kind of happened so early, and then the back end, you kept chasing what you had in 86 and you never quite got there. But when you look at the picture in totality and you see 84, like you said, 90 wins, 85, 98 wins. And then 88, you have 100 wins. And you don't even have a National League pennant from those 3 years. It's really fun. And then 87, when all of the shit, when everyone got hurt, the whole rotation got hurt at the same time. Bobby Ojeda almost chopped his finger off in a gardening accident. It was just bizarro land. And then that team just missed the playoffs too. And it's like, oh, Jesus, so many opportunities, so many chances, and they just fell short each year.
Yeah. That was the first year Doc went into rehab in 87. I remember I was down in New York at that point, and it was April 1st. It was announced that he was going into rehab, and the DJ on one of the stations said, "This is not an April Fool's joke. Doc's going." And at that point, he had such a squeaky clean image. It was a little surprising. So
that was the first, shoe to drop. And it's funny, he missed the 86 World Series parade because he was in a Long Island crack house, completely strung out on drugs. So he didn't even go to the championship. And a lot of Mets fans will point to that moment. It's the parade is when it all felt like that was the first cracks in the facade of things aren't quite right. And they never would be again. Obviously, then Strawberry would eventually leave and go to LA. Then he'd have his own problems, but and then also just bad management. A lot of issues with those late 80s Mets, and that could probably be a show of itself because there's so many talented guys, Kevin Mitchell, and you look at all the talented guys they ran out of town, and just the bad luck they had.
Yeah, we could spend a half hour talking about the people they played out of positions. Because of trades. Let's save that one. Quickly, Richie Ashburn, you mentioned him, 1962. He was an original Met. He batted .306. That was his final year. He was an All-Star and primarily was with the Phillies most of his career, but he did have a cup of coffee with the Mets in 62.
Yeah, even more than that. I mean, he was their first All-Star, I believe, and he had a good season for them. He played the whole year. If people don't know, they might be too young. Richie Ashburn was a singles hitter, double hitter, didn't hit for a lot of power, great contact, very fast. And he was fast up until the end. He was still pretty quick. I want to say that last season, he maybe even stolen over 10 bases. He was still pretty fast and pretty decent in the field. Like I said, he made the All-Star game that 62 season. And, I think the losing really wore him down because he retired. He was still in his late 30s. He was 37 when he retired. He was still pretty young. And
he was actually 35.
35. Yeah. I think he said before that was a tough year. He had been in the 1950 World Series. Yeah, the Phillies weren't great, but they at least could be, moderately competitive. And then he went to the Cubs for, I think, a year or two. And then he ended up with the Mets. And that year must have been to sit on that, to play every day on that team. When they only win 40 games, that's got to wear on you. Even if it's fun for the fans because a National League team is back, if you're actually playing in it every day and you've been around the block, that couldn't have been an enjoyable experience.
No, absolutely not. Let's go to Nolan Ryan, inducted in 99. He was a Met from 66 to 71. His record with the Mets was 29-38, so very pedestrian. They traded him in the offseason between 71 and 72 to the Angels for Jim Fregosi, who was an all-star shortstop with the Angels. They moved him over to third. The Mets forever had a problem finding a third baseman. And Fregosi didn't even make it to the all-star break of 73. They released him outright. And meanwhile, Nolan Ryan became Nolan Ryan. I was talking to a buddy earlier, and it's just was there something that happened that indicated you could have predicted what Nolan Ryan became? And we looked at his stats, and they were just very pedestrian with the Mets. And I just wonder, Chris, if he was one of these guys who didn't like playing in New York. I know he was kind of a Texas guy, small town guy. But the light came on when he got out to California and became Nolan Ryan. Yeah,
there was some of this was predictive though. So it depends what stats you look at, right? So if you look at game logs, which is the start by start that Ryan did, you can see the greatness because he'd have a game where he'd strike out 13 guys, walk 2 guys, give up 3 hits. And it's oh shit, this guy's amazing. And then the next 2 games he gets smacked around or he can't get out of the 4th inning because he's walking the ballpark. but you could see those glimmers of like absolute brilliance that you have to be really talented to pull off. And he did it enough times where it's like, oh, there's something here. There's something really potentially great here. Now, is there anything to predict that basically the second he gets to the Angels, he becomes an all-star Hall of Fame pitcher? No. I mean, like you said, the light switch literally flipped. And I don't know if it was, I mean, he's still in Los Angeles, so it's not like he's in, Alvin, Texas, where he's from. He's still in a pretty big city, but I don't know. I also just think it might have just been maturity. And I just think it might have been, it just clicked for him. And it was just, once again, just really bad timing for the Mets. I don't think if he stays with the Mets, he's still a Hall of Famer. Like, he's so talented. Like, I can't imagine any world where he's not a Hall of Famer. So I don't know. I think he would have been that great. And the Mets panic move, like you said, you get a third baseman, which is true really up until they get Robin Ventura. They do this for almost 40 years. So they just keep throwing away very talented people to chase this third baseman. And it really cost them. And it cost them. This is the biggest price they paid in their franchise. I mean,
you have to think they would have beaten the A's if Ryan was part of that rotation.
Yeah, you think so? I mean, I know I hate to look at it that small because who knows, series are funny. But I'll say one thing: they would have been they would have won a lot more games. They would have probably had another playoff appearance or 2 or 3. And maybe they win a pennant out of those 3 extra playoff appearances. Like, there would have been so many more opportunities if you have a pitcher like Nolan Ryan and Tom Seaver. Can you imagine that? Like, and to think you throw him away for this guy that's at the end of his. I know that Fergosi was like an old 32 when they got him. Like, he wasn't old by age, but you could tell he was already, I guess, kind of playing old. If you look at his stats, they certainly say that. And then, like you said, he was an instant disaster with the Mets. It never worked out. Terrible. I mean, one of the worst trades in baseball history, obviously.
Absolutely. Eddie Murray is the next one. 2 years with the Mets. If you look at it on paper, I think the first year he had 27 and 100 RBIs. The next year was like 92 or 93 RBIs. The 92, 93 Mets are some of the most unlikable teams, in my opinion, between Vince Coleman and Bobby Bonilla and Saberhagen and Murray, who was very sullen. Not a fun group to watch or kind of get behind. What were your thoughts on Eddie Murray as a Met?
Yeah, so I love Eddie Murray's career. My very first baseball glove was an Eddie Murray glove back when he was with the Orioles. I wasn't a huge Orioles fan. I just really loved his consistency. I just thought that there's a real value in the stuff that Eddie Murray can do. I just thought he was a really interesting player, and I loved watching him when he was older. By that point I was in New England, so I'd go to Red Sox games when I'd watch him play with the Orioles, or because he went back to or with Cleveland. I've always liked Eddie Murray. Having said that, you're absolutely right. Those 92 and 93 teams were atrocious. The 93 team lost over 100 games. There's a book, a very good book. Joel Sherman co-wrote it. It's called The Worst Team Money Could Buy.
Yeah, I've read it. Yeah, it's great.
Very funny. It's very entertaining. It's out of print, but it's definitely worth reading. And it talks about the 92 team, I believe. But the 93 team is even more bizarre. You have Vince Coleman throwing firecrackers at little kids. You have Brett Saberhagen shooting a super soaker at reporters.
Yeah.
And then you have people like Jeff Kent was on that team, and Jeff Kent's not the most personable guy. Eddie Murray is, like you said, not incredibly friendly. But you also had, you had some of the guys from '86. Gooden was a good starting pitcher for those teams. Sid Fernandez was getting hurt every other day, but he was still on that team. It was a weird mix of guys. Like, I'm not a big chemistry guy. Give me 25 talented guys. I don't care if they get along. But the counterpoint to that argument, though, is the 92 and 93 Mets, because those teams were pretty talented. I mean, they would never have won anything, but they probably should have been 500. But they were just really a miserable group of bastards that they were horrible. Like, the second they had any sort of, I guess Bobby Bonilla is the biggest example here, although Bonilla was very good in 93. It's kind of not fair. But any adversity at all, and they just would crumble. They just had no, as a team, individually they did, but as a team, they just could not stand any adversity. They would just disintegrate. Those teams were very bad, very hard to watch. And it took the Mets 5 years to recover from how horrible those teams were. Yeah, absolutely. Gary Carter was in the class of 2003, as was Eddie Murray. That was a big trade, December of '84.
They traded Yogi Brooks,
Floyd
Yeomans, yeah. And
it?
Mike Fitzgerald.
Yes.
And, 4 for 1. And, I was at that opening day in '85 where Carter hit the game-winning home run off Neil Allen, former Met. And, he just brought so much life to that team. You hear things, the various documentaries and various books, they called him Camera Carter, where he was always looking to be in front of the cameras and whatnot. But, he played with heart and grit and determination. What do you remember most about Gary Carter as a Met, though? He was with them for 4 years.
Yeah, 85 through 89, right? Or 85 through 88.
No, 5 years. 85 to
89. Okay. Gary Carter was awesome. His best years were 85 and 86. So I kind of caught him at the end of that. He's incredibly slow. I remember as a kid, I think I had his little starting lineup figurine. But watching him though, you knew you were seeing a great player. He had definitely earned that respect. Even among little kids would be like, oh, wow, this guy's going to be a Hall of Famer. Even a little kid knew that. Gary Carter's interesting. So I kind of want to talk a little about numbers getting retired. So the Mets are in this recent swing where they're retiring numbers left and right. And for the longest time, the rule was you had to be in the Hall of Fame as a Met to get your number retired. That was the rule. So the only person who's retired for a long time as a player was Tom Seaver. Now, Casey Stengel has his number retired and Gil Hodges has his number retired. But as a player, it was just Seaver. And then Piazza made it, and Piazza went in as a Met and he got his number retired. But then last year they broke tradition and they retired the number of Jerry Koosman. And I don't love it. Especially with the Yankees retire everybody's number. I kind of thought it was cool. The Mets had some standards there.
Right.
And this year retiring Keith Hernandez. And I think I like that even less. Now, Hernandez is a great broadcaster and was obviously a great player for the Mets. I don't mean to, but he was, if you had to pick what was his best team, it was actually probably the Cardinals, or whatever. It's a split. It's not like he's this lifelong Met. Like if you're going to retire a number, maybe David Wright, you can make a case for, but with Hernandez, is this what we're going to do now? We're going to retire everybody's number. So the reason I talk about Carter is I was in New York when Carter died and we kind of kept waiting for his number to retire. And that's a situation where, yes, he played for the Mets for a short time. He actually wanted to go in as a Met. The Hall of Fame wouldn't let him. And if you retired his number, I would have been totally fine with that because he's a Hall of Famer, played with the Mets. But Jerry Koosman and Keith Hernandez, they're not Hall of Famers. That kind of rubs me the wrong way. I think retiring a number should be a really special thing. And I think you should do it in very extreme circumstances. You have a team Hall of Fame to honor your greatest players in your team, but the number retirement, though, that should have been sacred, and it's not anymore. And I guess now the dam's broken, so now it'll be everyone, I guess.
Yeah, that's and that was kind of cool that the Mets only had a couple numbers retired there for the longest time. Listen, to me, Hernandez and Carter both should have their numbers retired. They were so important turning around that team. Hernandez even more so than Carter. Koosman, I kind of agree. I mean, he was steady and he was a fan favorite, but really probably not worthy of getting his number retired. But you coming up, you got David Wright, and then you have the issue of, okay, well, if you're going to do Hernandez and if you're going to do Carter, what are you doing with Doc and Darryl?
Yeah.
Do you even consider those guys after everything?
They deserve it more than Keith does, and I love Keith, but Doc and Darryl deserve it. I would say way more than Keith Hernandez does. If you're just looking at simply just what do they mean to when they played? Now, if you consider the broadcasting element, that's a little different. So maybe then Keith does kind of move up the ranks. But like you said, you can't, once you open that Pandora's box, you start to have to make some pretty tough decisions. I don't know. Yeah. Well, I don't know.
So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, Chris. I want to be respectful of your time. And so we're going to pass on Ricky Henderson, who played for the Mets.
Very happy to have him there. It was fun. Ricky Henderson is one of my favorite players growing up. So that was a blast when they got him. It was fun when the Red Sox got him in 2003 or 2002 as well. It was fun to be able to go and see him. Ricky Henderson is absolute great player. And he's pretty good at the Mets.
25 years, 9 different teams. It's amazing.
With the A's 4 or 5 different times too. It's wild.
And then I have a guy here who maybe is one of the biggest busts in Mets history, Roberto Alomar, 02-03.
Yeah, they didn't trade much for him. They traded away with Alex Escobar, who was supposed to be a huge outfield prospect. But the trade worked out for nobody. He ended up becoming a bust. And then the second Roberto Alomar got to the Mets, you could tell. And I watched him all in the American League, watching Red Sox games, Red Sox, Indians, whatever. And then, obviously with the Blue Jays and the Orioles. So I was pretty familiar with Alomar. The second I saw him play that first game, like, oh shit, like he had lost like 2 steps. He got old overnight. He wasn't that old, but he literally like became a different player overnight. He was out of baseball in like 3 years. 3 years later, he was done. Like, it was. I don't know if I've ever seen a player, honestly, a Hall of Fame player, get that old that fast.
Yeah, it happened really.
Oh my God.
Yeah. In 2014, Joe Torre was nominated or inducted by the Veterans Committee. He was a player from 75 to 77. Then they made him manager after they fired Joe Frazier. Is that correct? And he was their manager from 77 to 81, led a bunch of terrible Mets teams through that time. Great. Pretty steady ball player. He won the MVP in 71 with the Cardinals, but obviously mostly now remembered as the Yankees manager. So we'll skip him.
Yeah, obviously Mets fans have, I would say, obviously I'm younger, so maybe some people disagree. Mets fans I've talked to that I know have no connection to him as a Met.
Right.
Like Joe Torre as a player was a Brave, and then as a manager was, entirely Yankees.
This one, I'm curious on your take because this was in your sweet spot. What were your opinions when the Mets signed Tom Glavine, who is the next one on the list? He played for 5 years.
So I'm in a minority here. So I'm a pretty big Glavine guy. I think Glavine served a real purpose. I thought he was actually pretty good with the Mets. He was never great. He was always okay. Some Mets fans expected him to come in and be the same Tom Glavine he was 10 years earlier, and that just wasn't fair or realistic. But Seaver was a really dependable, like 3rd, 4th starter for like 4 years with the Mets. And, he didn't really start to disintegrate until that last season with the Braves, went back to the Braves, and he couldn't do it anymore. The problem with Glavine, though, is everyone said he had no heart, and for the Mets. And then he pitched in that game 162 and he got shelled. The Mets needed a win to make the playoffs, and they got annihilated. And he was a big reason why. Yeah. Another funny Glavine thing. So Glavine was in the cab, I guess, going to the game, and the cab driver stopped short, and Tom Glavine smacked his face on the back of the cab, and it broke his tooth. I think he had to miss that start. But that was being this weird New York injury where, like, of course, there's a cab ride accident that kept Glavine out of a start. But Glavine didn't miss many starts though, and I thought he was good. And Mets fans still, if you bring him up, you'll get a lot of dirty looks. But I think a lot of people still associate him with the Braves, obviously, and they thought he was like a Brave spy or like sabotaging the Mets. But he was fine. He did a good job. I have better memories than most about Tom Glavine. Yeah,
and it's to your point. Each of the 5 seasons, he started at least 32 games, so he was durable. Unlike the next guy on the list, Pedro Martinez, who played 4 years with the Mets, and only one of those seasons he started more than 30 games. So it was a bit of an injury-plagued situation with Pedro. He was
complete opposite experience too. So yeah, Pedro, you said that first season was quite good. It was actually better than in 05. He was better than he was in 04 when the Red Sox won the World Series. Right. And then he got off to a great start in 06. I think he made the All-Star game, and then he got injuries and he became like horrible overnight. But Mets fans, if you ask Mets fans about Pedro, you'll get nothing but smiles and happy faces, even though by most accounts, if you look at it just from the numbers, Glavine had a better Mets career than Pedro did. But Pedro was just so warmly regarded. I think the big thing was he was the beginning of them getting better. Now, it didn't amount to anything because none of those Mets teams made the playoffs at the end of that first decade. But the 03-04, there was like Roberto Alomar, stinky teams. They were just miserable to watch. He had grumpy Glavine, who was okay, but those teams were losing 90 games. And Pedro got there, and that was the first year they were over 500 in a while. And then in 06, they obviously went to the LCS. So Pedro is very warmly regarded by Mets fans, which is funny because, like I said, Glavine was better.
Right. Next is Piazza, and he's obviously your guy. 308 lifetime batting average, 427 home runs. I remember the buzz in New York. I was living down there, obviously, at the time when that trade occurred. I mean, everybody was just beside themselves that they got. It was like really the first. I guess Carter was a superstar, but Piazza was like in his complete prime, coming to the Mets, and it electrified the fan base.
Oh, it did. It was the first star they had in a long time. Because you think about those 90s teams in the mid-90s, those teams were a little better. But you had guys like Bernard Gilkey, who had a really good year for them. Lance Johnson had a good year for them. But that's not going to excite you. You had guys like Mark Clark. It was just kind of a boring team. Todd Hundley had a good year one year. But, I mean, these are not, you're not going to see those guys in Cooperstown. And then, they get Piazza, and it was like, holy shit. Plus, that team was already pretty good. That 97 team was pretty good. So to get someone like Piazza 98, you're like, oh, my God, this team has a real shot now. And that was exciting because, you're chasing the Braves every year, who are a great team, obviously. You have the Yankees right there in town, who are in the middle of a dynasty. So it felt like the Mets were like, all right, now we belong. Like, we're looking at our big brothers for so long, but now we can actually play with them. And it led to some exciting stuff. 98, 99, 2000 was pretty fun. Even 2001 had some like interesting stuff happen with the Mets. And it was a fun 4-year swing for Mets fans. It was a really interesting time to be a Mets fan. It didn't, we got an NL pennant out of it. So I guess there's something, but yeah, Piazza, a great player, obviously, deserves a Hall of Fame. The only thing, you have that steroid, is he a steroid guy? If you put a gun to my head, I probably say yes, but I'm going to just put my head in the sand and say no.
There you go. There's spoken like a true Mets fan. And of course, the last person who's going to be inducted this year is Gil Hodges, put in by the Veterans Committee over the winter. He played for the Mets in 62, 63, as you mentioned, managed them from 68 to 71, and of course led the amazing Mets to the 69 World Series, brought a true professionalism to the organization, leadership. You hear that 69 team, those guys talk about Gil Hodges and how important he was, and they just all loved him and respected him. Oh,
you're absolutely right. I got to go to the 50th anniversary Mets like celebrate the all-time team. So you had, you had everyone from Piazza there, but you had obviously Seaver and Cleon Jones. You had the greatest. It was really cool. It's a fun event. All the 69 guys like went out of their way to bring up Gil Hodges. Like, we can't forget about Gil. Like, what Gil Hodges, like, Seaver would say it until he died, how Gil Hodges taught him professionalism, taught him how to be a Major League Baseball player. But all the Kuzman, all those guys just speak so glowingly of Hodges. He must have been an awesome manager. And you figure he wasn't that much older than them. He was still in his 40s when they won the World Series. So, to instill that kind of respect, but he did. Those guys, I know I haven't heard too many older players as a group speak that highly of a manager as those Mets teams did of Gil Hodges. Must have been incredible. It's a shame. It's obviously very sad.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the rundown of the Hall of Famers. I got a couple of quick takes I need from you, and then I'm going to let you go. Again, Chris, really appreciate you jumping on today.
Before we do that, I do want to bitch about one thing.
Oh,
the Mets Hall of Fame is driving me crazy. So I hate the Patriots. I'm a Jets fan. But man, the Patriots do it right. So the Patriots do is every year they induct one player into their Patriots Hall of Fame. And they have a special building for it. The Patriots Hall of Famers used to get these like red jackets. They're kind of goofy, but they're fun. And they nominate they'll have a panel nominate like 4 guys, and the fans vote each year. And the fans do a pretty good job. That Hall of Fame is actually, if you look at the list, like, oh, that's a pretty good group. They figured it out. And it's so simple. 1 guy a year. No brainer. The Mets, meanwhile, fuck it up. And they fucked it up since day one. They had the Hall of Fame created in the early 80s, but they didn't actually put it in place until Citi Field was built. But of course, the Wilpons, idiots, they built the giant store down on that lower level, and they didn't have any room for a Hall of Fame until the next year when fans complained. They're like, what are you doing? The first thing you see when you walk in is Jackie Robinson, which is fine, but he was never a Met. No. You made this place, the seats are green to look like Ebbets Field, which is fine, but that was where the Dodgers played, because Fred Wilpon was a Dodger fan growing up. Yep. And the place had no Mets history, so finally they smartened up between that first, I think it was 09 and 10, and they built the Hall of Fame as part of that store, and it's actually pretty nice. It's all in there. It's nice. Each Hall of Famer has its own plaque. So I was like, all right, cool. You guys figured, maybe you can do one a year. And in 2012, they did John Franco. 2013, they did Mike Piazza. And then they don't induct anyone for 7 years. And then they induct 3 guys. Well, he had COVID as well. But over the span of 2 years, you have 3 guys go in. I don't know if anyone's slated to go in this year. And there's some like decent guys that could go in, like obviously David Wright. But if you want to wait for him, I don't know, not to make the Hall of Fame, I don't know what they're waiting for with that, but whatever. Right. Howard Johnson could make it. There's a few guys, Al Leiter. There's a say
Sid Fernandez, right?
Sid Fernandez could make it. So like, there's a few guys that have a real, the team Hall of Fame. That's what's special. You can go and honor guys that have no chance of making it to Cooperstown, but guys that meant a lot to you as a fan, and the plaques right there. And I think it's a great way to teach kids about history of baseball, and because they can actually see the plaque in front of them. You don't need to go all the way to Cooperstown. It frustrates me to no end when I see the Patriots, who I despise, do it right. Yep. And then the Mets, who I love, it just seems kind of like it's like a clumsy mess. I don't know what they're doing. Just do one a year. It's not that hard. That actually angers me. Like, I think about it at least once a week and it pisses me off. I know that says a lot about my life and my priorities, but it really does frustrate the hell out of me. Okay. All right, that's my pitch about that.
Get off that soapbox. Favorite all-time Met player and why?
Probably David Wright. He just seems like such a good human being. He's so easy to root for. He was part of that World Series team. I got to go to those games. That was so much fun. Obviously Gooden and Strawberry. I got to see that kind of the end. I never got to see Gooden at his peak in 85. I was too young, but you still got to see them, especially Strawberry was quite good in the late 80s. And Piazza was great, but Piazza was always kind of, I don't know, it's always something kind of off about him a little bit. Like he was a tough guy he's an easy guy to like, or a tough guy to love. And yeah, I'd see David Wright.
Okay.
And then you got DeGrom in there too. You got to put him in there, but he's so much fun to watch. But David Wright though was so good for so long and such a good person. You didn't hear one bad word about him. I never heard one person say that he was an asshole, anything negative.
Captain America. Citi Field or Shea Stadium?
Oh, Citi Field. Shea Stadium is. I'll tell you, I take Shea Stadium 10 times before I take Fenway Park. I hate Fenway. I think Fenway is an old dump. I hate these old parks. The Boston fans deserve a new stadium. They won't get one, but that's what they deserve. Citi Field's great. There has some bad sight lines. If you go to certain parts of that upper deck, especially, you can get blocked out. In the lower deck too has some weird roof angles and stuff. But the food is fantastic. Best food in any ballpark, any sport I've ever been to is at Citi Field. And they do it right. They have if you're a season ticket holder, you get to go in like the Caesars Clubhouse, which is nice in case there's a rain delay. You can go hang out in there. They have all these little like promenade clubs that you can go into and get warm if it's cold out, or escape the heat if it's boiling hot. I don't know. I love that park, so I'm big Citi Field guy.
All right, so I've only been there twice. One actually was for a Dead concert. So I still have a soft spot for Shea Stadium. And I actually got to see a few Jets games at Shea Stadium.
Oh wow. Yeah.
I was at the last 1983, the last home game. They played the Steelers, and I have some great pictures, even when I was like 10, of Joe Namath playing at Shea. It's very cool.
Well, you're a Jets fan like I am. So that's awesome. Nothing. There were a few things more fun than like a hot July day. You sit all the way up top, and this is when I was young too, but you sit all the way on that top deck. The sun's hitting you. You're watching baseball. There was really nobody ever sat up there for most games. So you'd have a whole section to yourself. You spread out. You're with your buddies, and you're just hanging out watching baseball. Like, what a great way to spend a July or August. That's why I always say, like, the best place to be in the summer is Long Island. Take the train right to the Mets game. You got these great beaches like Robert Moses and Jones Beach right there. You can't beat a summer on Long Island. If I could live for just 3 months on Long Island, I would totally do it.
Where did you live in Long Island?
I lived in Deer Park.
Okay. I actually lived in Northport.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we were in Northport last year. That's a great spot.
Funny.
Yeah.
I think I know the answer to this one, but prediction for this season for the Mets?
They're good. They're real good. They're making the playoffs. I think they're going to win the division. Playoffs are crazy. You never know what's going to happen because they're going to win the World Series because who knows? But I would never have imagined the Braves after losing Acuna would have won the World Series last year. So
yeah,
you don't know. I know one thing. They're damn good. I think they have a really good chance of, when I say good, I mean, they could win 95, 100 games. Like that could really happen, especially if DeGrom comes back healthy next month. They have the reason too. You have guys like Tyler McGill, David Peterson, and thinking like, all right, that's their 6 and 7 starter, and McGill's look great. Peterson's look good. They just have the depth. So like when these guys, look at, they have guys like JD Davis, Dominic Smith, who are not great players, but they're great bench players. And if anyone gets hurt, you can put those kind of caliber player in. So I think they're protected. And then on top of it, you have Steve Cohen, who has all this money, and he said that he's going to spend at the deadline. So they're not done yet. They're going to go get more good players. If someone does get hurt, a major contributor, they can go out and replace them. They can go talk to whoever's doing badly and, just go see if we can get some more guys from the A's, or, maybe the Red Sox continue to stink and go grab someone from them. And it won't cost you much for prospects probably because you're willing to take on the full salary. So I don't know. I think they're really good. They're certainly a lot better than your stinky Yankees.
Listen, that's another conversation. I'm going to pound my head through this wall with that team. Okay, one idea for your show, or any show you're going to do.
Good ideas.
Okay, me and the nominees. A lot of discussion this week on KMS about me. And I don't know if you said it or Kirk said it. Who wants to see a movie from the 1930s? Why not condense that and do me and the nominees from the 21st century?
I'll put it this way. That is very close to what I potentially might do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Look at us.
That's the, not exactly that, but very close. And that is the leader in the clubhouse by far. That is, the 21st century is putting together like a best of or something like that. That's very intriguing to me. And that is, I won't just keep it to just Oscar nominated films, but I thought just like, all right, so everyone knows the best films of the 20th century. You got Citizen Kane, Godfather, Goodfellas, Gone with the Wind, or whatever your Casablanca. But what are the best films of this century? And that gets a little bit muddier. You have like There Will Be Blood. You have some people might even say Get Out. But it's not as clear cut, obviously, because the century is so new. But there have still been a lot of great movies that I would love to discuss with people. So that is that's the leader in the clubhouse. I'm still haven't committed to it yet, but that is very, very, very high on my list.
All right, great. I'm glad we're thinking along the same line. Good. Listen, thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate the time. And this was fun. And maybe as the season goes on, we could kind of connect again on another topic, or just shoot the shit about what's going on with this season. But I really appreciate you joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And let's go Mets.
Let's go Mets. And thanks to everybody. Again, Kirk Minahan Network. Thank you, Kirk. Thanks, Dave, as always, for the support. I have another guest lined up. Going to go back to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for my next episode. And I think it's going to hit some people's sweet spots. So that's what I'm going to say. And thanks for joining me, and we'll see you real soon. Have a great day.